Good morning and happy new year, everyone. Welcome back to The Crawl, the show where we break down the future of search, brand authority, and everything else AI is rewriting about digital marketing. My name is Tristan Harris. I'm your host, and today we'll actually be going back in time to talk about the history of AI. With a new year comes new innovations, and we will touch on what we think AI has in store for us this year, as well as for years to come. But everything has a past, including AI. So we're going to talk about where AI began, its evolution, and where it's headed next with our guest, H.P. Newquist. H.P. Newquist is one of the foremost authorities in the history and application of artificial intelligence. And his career in AI spans 4 decades, beginning with the creation of AI Trends, the first ever publication to explore the practical use of artificial intelligence. Since then, he has given presentations about the potential of AI all around the world, and his work has appeared in and been cited by such diverse publications as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, Variety, Billboard, Forbes, Popular Mechanics, Rolling Stone, Computer World, USA Today, and more. He is also the author of more than 24 books that have been translated into multiple languages, and his books on technology and science have received awards from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Library Association, and the National Science Teachers Association. His book on the effort to create machines that think, The Brain Makers, is considered the definitive book on the early history of artificial intelligence. Currently, Newquist oversees the Relayer Group, which makes AI real and relevant by its publishing and curatorial projects. And with that, please welcome H.P. Newquist to the show. So, HP, how are you doing today?
Good. Thank you for having me today.
You're very welcome. Is it ever a little weird to have somebody read off, the kind of walkthrough of your career?
Yeah, actually it is. And thank you for covering all that. One person, I think, hit the nail on the head when he said, this is quite a rap sheet. And I guess in retrospect, it kind of sounds like that. But yes, it seems like I've spent more time doing this than I'd like to admit.
Yeah, I feel that way, and I probably only have a third of the rap sheet you have, so I definitely get it. So before we really dive into the history of AI, one thing I do want to point out that we spoke about briefly before the show, HB is also a musician in his own right. He's the founder of the National Guitar Museum, which personally to me is a musician. I'm super excited to chat with you after the show about that.
Anytime.
And I'll plug your SoundCloud too, just so
Okay.
people can check out what you've been working on. I was listening to your song "Sharp Food" before this show, and I was jamming out to it. I was digging the guitars. So, anyways, so could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background in AI? What really got you interested in it in the very beginning?
Well, like I said, I've been doing it for more years than I'd like to admit, but it really goes back to the 60s. My father was in the computer business back when mainframes and mini computers were the primary force in the computing business, if you even want to call it back then, before there were PCs. And so I grew up around machines, computers, devices, ever since I was a little kid. And I went off to college. I got a degree in English. And after I got out of college, I began writing and doing marketing for a small computer firm because I could understand the things that they needed to promote. And over time, I ended up also being a marketing person for them. So I actually went out and chatted about the products, and a couple of publishers came to me and said, hey, you seem to know how to present this information, and it's all new. And now I'm jumping into the early 80s. It's all new to us, and mostly the people who know about it are engineers, yet you can write about it. And I was approached by a small publisher who's already doing things on semiconductors and the growing PC market. And they said, what do you think would be really interesting that nobody's touched on? And my answer was artificial intelligence. I was a sci-fi fan as a kid. I loved reading sci-fi where the machines took over the world. And together we formed the first publication, AI Trends, that started looking at what was coming out of the labs in AI. And so that's how I got started. That went on to being me writing for dozens of publications and being a columnist for several national magazines, which dovetailed literally with the rise of AI, the first wave of AI, which is now a different story than how I got into AI.
Awesome. Thank you. And when people nowadays hear AI, they usually think of Chat GPT or, Mid Journey or image generators. But the idea of AI goes back much further. So when you mentioned, you were tracking the things coming out of the lab, what kind of things were coming out back then from an AI standpoint?
Well, you have to realize that the term artificial intelligence was coined in 1956, which is before any of us were born, or many of us were born. And you had researchers at places like MIT and Dartmouth and Carnegie Mellon looking at trying to make machines do things that people could do. How can we make them behave like humans? And those first efforts were things like chess playing machines and checkers playing machines. And the government during the 50s and 60s funded a lot of that research, but it never really went anywhere, simply because the computing power wasn't there and you were feeding things into computers with punch cards and tape. So in the early 80s, when I started writing about it, you had really the first commercial wave, which is the second development wave, um, of laboratory researchers who are working on things like rule-based systems and natural language and voice recognition. So there was a push, again, amongst mostly high-end researchers to try and do more than create chess players and checkers players. And there were, by the mid 1980s, there were about 300 companies in the world uh, doing artificial intelligence commercialization. They were taking guys out of the lab, and it was primarily guys, very few women, and giving them companies or creating companies around them to sell artificial intelligence thinking machines to the government and to the military and large corporations. It was a big push. As I said, there were 300 some odd companies back in the mid 80s. Today, by the way, in the United States alone, there are over 15,000 AI companies. So we've come a long way. Uh, so the ideas that were being promoted back then were things like rule-based systems, where if you wanted to have a computer tell you how to repair a manufacturing boiler, you actually typed in every rule that the person or people uh, who repaired that boiler knew. So you'd spend months going, if the boiler breaks down at this temperature, do this. If the boiler freezes up at this temperature, then do that. And they would take hundreds and thousands of rules and put them into a computer, usually a mini computer. And each of those programs could do one thing. So you couldn't use that boiler repair application for helping with your marketing pitch or helping you prepare a speech. It was one thing, and it was incredibly time intensive and incredibly computer intensive. By about 1993, the users were like, this isn't working for us. It costs too much. We can only use it for one thing at a time. We're done. And by 1994, all 300 of those companies were gone. So the first wave of commercial AI was done by about 1994 with very little to show for it, except for using some of that rule-based information to create the early search engines like Yahoo, Netscape, even early Google were built on some of those rule-based systems that pretty much all of the rest of the world had given up on.
That's really interesting. So I did have a question around how early computers kind of shaped what people thought AI could be or couldn't be. And it seems in this case, tying back to that rule system, I understand why that first wave of commercialization kind of fizzled out, right? Because if you have to spend that much time creating a thinking machine to look at how to repair a boiler if it breaks down, why wouldn't you just hire somebody that's worked with boilers for 30 years and knows it inherently, right?
Right.
So that's really interesting.
Well, to your why couldn't you just hire somebody? A lot of those things that were created that were successful, and again, there weren't a lot, but
Mhm.
of those that were successful, many of them were built as legacy systems. So, for instance, the boiler system that I'm talking about was actually created by Campbell's Soup. And they had a guy who had been working there for over 40 years who was getting ready to retire. And he trained a number of people to work for him, but with turnover and stuff, he was the one who had been there the longest that had the industrial or the institutional knowledge. And so they were trying to capture everything he knew and the people who worked with him knew before he retired. So there was this sense that if we don't capture it now, it might be lost. And if this boiler that he knows from the year it was created breaks down, do we have the people who can ever repair it? So there were a lot of things like those legacy systems that drove early AI. And again, they were very isolated. You couldn't use them outside of their intended purpose, but they did kind of provide a proof of concept.
That's really interesting. And you had mentioned that primarily a lot of those companies were, selling to uh, the government or military. And I know that the early days of computerization with government systems, there are a lot of them that still exist today that are legacy systems from the
Right.
80s and 90s. Some of them very much, explicitly so when they're air gapped and built a certain way to avoid, potential bad actors. But
Exactly.
uh,
Yeah.
it's really interesting. So I'm sure that somewhere in that 300 companies there was somebody working on a kind of thinking machine knowledge base for those as well, which is pretty interesting. So
Well, some of the, those kind of rule-based things are becoming popular again. Now that we've got all the chatbots and all
mhm.
the LLMs, um, when they hallucinate and maybe don't double check themselves, there's a movement now to do what's called inferencing and basically check using rules that come back and go, well, okay, it gave you this answer, but can it follow a guideline, a rule-based guideline, and show you that it's followed these rules in order to produce an answer for you? So it's kind of ironic in a way that 30 years later, rule-based systems are now being kind of reapplied to the AI that eventually worked where the rules-based systems initially did not.
That's really interesting. Yeah, it's a full circle moment in the development of AI where, the
Yeah.
probably the things that we learned early on, not we, but the collective we learned early on are relevant again and helpful. So another thing you had mentioned with the first wave of commercialization. So AI has kind of undergone multiple boom and bust cycles, right?
Yeah.
So looking back, were early expectations just unrealistic, or was it that the technology was just too far ahead of its time?
Um, Pretty much all of the above. There was an insane amount of hype, just like there is today. And a lot of what I talk to people about today is we've seen this movie before. They're talking about an AI bubble and is there hype and is it really going to create the kinds of changes in business and society that people like Sam Altman are claiming are going to happen? Well, we had guys back in the 80s and 90s. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite magazine covers of all time was in 1984. And Business Week did a cover with the Scarecrow from Wizard of Oz holding a computer. And the headline was Artificial Intelligence, It's Here. That was 1984. So people were like, oh my God, it's going to change everything. And the reality was um, the technology was moving ahead quickly, but it hit a wall in terms of processing speed, in terms of memory capability, the exact kind of things that NVIDIA ended up addressing. When you have a rule-based system, there's several thousand rules. It could take hours back then to try and crank out an answer. Now we think nothing of ChatGPT delivering an answer in 3 seconds. So not only it hit not only the processing and hardware, you know, storage wall. It also hit a wall in terms of how you got that information into the rules. As I was saying earlier, you've got to interview people for weeks and sometimes months at a time to get a great legacy system. Well, with the use of neural networks, which were barely even considered back then, even though neural nets go back to the 1950s as well, people didn't know how to process them simply because neural nets didn't work well with linear PC based computing. But now that we have the processing power, especially because of GPUs, you don't have to input every single rule. You send the LLM off, and it generates its own rules, and you let it go train on its training set, and it comes back and says, "Okay, here are the rules I've created." And so the time and money spent in processing power and interviewing people now is sort of taken off the table because LLMs were designed to do that on their own.
That's a really interesting point. I think too that it brings up the question of, if these are auto-generating these rule sets, who is going through and QAing them, right? So who's going through and making sure that there's not a hallucination in the rule set that will lead to, a snowball of effects down the road?
Well, that's the big problem, right? We've got you've got red teams that companies are supposed to put in place to be able to flag when the LLM is going off the wrong direction and creating the wrong answers, or not able to constrain itself to what the prompt is looking for. The overarching concern of AI, I think, regardless of who's producing it or pitching it or selling it or distributing it, is who's making sure that it's right. And right now, that's up to the user because there's no regulation, there's no guardrails, for lack of a better term, that the AI companies are going to put on themselves. They're sort of like, hey, everybody loves this stuff, do with it what you will. But there's no specific way, unless companies that are using it have deployed it, like users who are actually going in and prompting it. There's no actual way to say this is always going to be the right answer, which was interesting because rule-based systems, each one was a rule. It had a defined, here's an input, here's an output. If this, then that. Again, kind of why we're coming back to some of the rule-based systems, but by and large, getting someone to keep it from hallucinating or to keep it on track it's the wild, wild west, and you're kind of on your own.
Yeah, and I think that evolution is going to be really interesting to watch real time. And the anecdote I have from this, my brother-in-law has a supplement company that's neuro kind of supplements. It's for
Right.
helping focus and things along those lines. And he's noticed that with ChatGPT and some of the other models, whereas he used to be able to do research and kind of like figure out formulations, now it's basically like, we can't tell you to do that. And I think that's probably due to concerns around lawsuits, around
Right.
actual harm that could be done if it does hallucinate. If it says like, oh yeah, you can take 100,000 milligrams of caffeine, no problem, put it in your supplements. Yeah,
Right.
like it could definitely cause some problems. So I think it'll be interesting to watch over the next couple of years how that self-regulation gets built in, because there's certain areas with health, with legal things along those lines, where if it does hallucinate and tell somebody the wrong thing, it could have pretty disastrous results, right? So that's an area that's going to be interesting.
Yeah, that's especially when you talk about the law or medicine. If the potential exists that somebody could die, then yeah, you've got a huge problem. And the AI companies have begun to backtrack, saying, we're not responsible for what the users do. And there's certainly been, a number of cases where kids have used chatbots and have become enamored of them or become best friends with them, and have ended up taking their own lives because the chatbots have led them down the wrong road when they were depressed or unhappy with their lives at school. And so the AI companies are having to back off that. And they do have the exact kind of things you're saying, which is in some cases, that goes outside our guidelines. Or, ask another question because we don't talk about self-harm in our responses, or we don't talk about bots. Not all AI chatbots do that. I mean, there are plenty of AI chatbots out there that will be more than happy to talk to you about bomb making and that kind of stuff. But they are backing off to some degree. That doesn't stop everybody, and it doesn't stop every query, but that's kind of their fallback. Like, hey, we told them not to ask this question, that we wouldn't answer it. But the truth is, you can, if you ask a question in a certain way,
Yep.
you can get pretty much anything you want.
Yeah, and that's the other side of the coin, is when you ask users to self-regulate, users that don't want to self-regulate are going to
Right.
find a way around whatever, guardrails are put in place. And that's something that, you can test and try out yourself. So anybody listening to this, if you want, you can probably go try to figure that out. But yeah, it's definitely an area that is really interesting, somewhat scary. But it's an area that, some regulation, whether it's from the company, whether it's the user themselves, or, a entity like the government, probably should step in certain
Right.
areas when it, like you said, if it has the ability for somebody to, die from something, like that's probably something that needs to be, carefully regulated.
Exactly. And most of the states have created state regulations that prohibit AI companies from producing products that will talk about that, or they've got to produce warnings, or they've got to stop a conversation when it starts talking about certain topics. And even in Florida, which has been heavily aligned with the current administration, recently the Trump administration signed an executive order saying there should be no states' rights when it comes to AI regulation. There, no AI company should be subjected to an individual state's concerns over those of the federal government. And you already have pushback from Colorado, from Arizona, from most states, and Florida in particular, which has been aligned with the administration, saying, no, 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 no. You can't just let AI companies do whatever they want to do. They need to have some kind of regulation. And the current administration is more than happy to be like to talk about, well, if we don't let them do what they want, China's going to beat us to the finish line. So we got to take off any regulation, which is great for companies like Anthropic and X and OpenAI, because they can go freewheeling. But it's not great for the states when they've got to deal with their communities who are saying this stuff is potentially harmful to our kids, to our jobs, whatever it might be. We need some regulation. So there's that in this coming year is going to be a huge political football in terms of states' rights versus federal interest in making sure AI grows and even explodes worldwide.
Yeah, and it's almost like there's a bias inherent in, how much GDP is being created by these companies, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the value to the government to continue kind of supporting them, and the regulation, potentially getting in the way. That's an area that personally I don't have too much of an opinion on. I know that as is, regulation is pretty needed in this space. And I think that, doing it on a state level does 100% cause an issue with companies that are, operating across every state. And that's, again, I don't have much of an opinion on it. So it's just going to be interesting to see how it folds out.
It is, and it's because the states are getting their citizens to demand do something about this, which is one step removed from the federal government. They feel like they have to do something, and don't want the administration to just overrule that. And it gets back to the analogy I usually use, which is nuclear testing and regulation. Um, AI has some potential for incredible good and potential for incredible harm. Same with nuclear. If done well, it can be incredibly useful for people. Even at the smallest level, we use nuclear radiation for things like MRIs and all kinds of devices, medical devices. But in the wrong hands, yeah, it can be devastating to humanity. AI is a lot like nuclear power in that way. We do regulate the way nuclear power and nuclear material are used. Why can't we do that with AI? You don't want the wrong people using it, so at least set some guidelines, set some rules. The current administration would have you go, oh, people can do whatever they want with nuclear power. Let's see what happens, and maybe we'll keep the rest of the world at bay if all of our citizens come up with nuclear devices.
Yeah, which would be a little terrifying. And
Yeah.
I haven't yet asked ChatGPT how to build a nuclear reactor, and I don't think I'd understand it if it told me. But that's an interesting point. And we've seen both the good from AI. I think a lot of us have had a positive. AI has had a positive impact on a lot of people, whether it's in their day-to-day work, whether it's from a cultural like art standpoint. I think most people have played around with, even if they're not an artist. I can't draw to save my life. I couldn't draw a stick figure if you put a gun to my head. But I've really enjoyed being able to kind of express the crazy thoughts I have in my head and see it turn into something on paper. But the flip side of that, like you said, is the negative aspect. So something we see every day here is the impact that AI search has on smaller brands like mom and pop shops, smaller e-com brands, places that don't have the resources that, let's say, Walmart or Amazon have, that are trying just to survive. And historically, we're really putting a lot of money into paid advertising and devoting time to building up their rankings on search, right? And now we're seeing that a lot of that has declining value, and a lot of companies, especially smaller ones, are losing traffic to site. They're losing business, and that's kind of our side of the game is helping people from that. So we've seen a lot of that firsthand, is that there's a lot of really amazing things that are coming from it, but there is an inherent risk and a lot of change in the industry. So
yeah, that's true. And all of our jobs going forward are potentially affected by AI. And the thing that was really interesting in the early days of AI, and even from the 50s into the 80s and 90s, was that AI was going to affect people who were in blue collar jobs. We would get robotics, we would get automation. I was even talking about the boiler repair. You've got, instead of having a team of people who were going to try and repair this boiler, you had one person who could use the AI to go ahead and repair the boiler. So it was always a concern for the working class is the ones who are going to be in trouble. With ChatGPT, that whole notion of robotics and automation being the focus of AI got flipped on its head. So now it's the creative and executive classes who are in danger of being replaced by AI. You talk about drawing, there's illustrators, graphic designers, writers, editors, photographers in some cases, also executives. How many executives do you need to make decisions when, instead of sitting in a room full of COOs, CEOs, C-suite executives, you can ask your ChatGPT version of those people and say, give me 6 opinions on what we should do with the company. Why should it have to go around with a group of people in suits and ties? That's the biggest change that the new generation, this wave of AI is kind of unleashing, is that there's no real protected job category unless it's something you're doing with your hands. So if you're a plumber, or you're an electrician, or you're a tree trimmer or a landscaper, you're fine. ChatGPT is only going to be there to help you. Might help you run your business better, might help you get more ideas for how to expand your business, might give you more ideas on how to promote your business. But it's not going to take your job because it can't go and cut branches off of a dead tree. It can't go and ratchet, a sink into place. It's completely different than what we thought 30 years ago AI would be capable
Yeah, until we have the Plumbot 3000 show up at our front door, swap out the toilet.
of. Yeah. Well, that's, that there's a ton of robot hype right now, especially in the last 6 months with some of the robots that are under $15,000 that are coming out of China. And they always show them running kind of like the old, and not even really that old, the Boston Dynamics dogs. They're running, they're
Yep.
jumping, and that's all well and good. But, try to get a robot to fold laundry or to hang up a shirt. It can't do the simplest things that people can do. So it's all scary and wonderful when you see it jogging up a mountain or picking up, a forklift, or acting like a forklift and picking up a pallet. But that doesn't mean it's going to be capable of cooking your breakfast for you.
I saw this. It might have been at CES or some big show like that years ago, probably around like 2013, 2014. This product that was a combination washer dryer. It was like this massive, like the size of the wall behind me, and it took your clothes from the hopper through the process and folded them. And it took ages to do, and it was this big, oh my gosh moment. And they only wanted like $60,000 for it. So it's
Right.
like it's a lot of the robotic side. I don't think I don't think we're gonna see a humanoid robot come into our house and fold our laundry soon. I could be wrong. I've been wrong once before. It could happen again. But yeah, you're right. A lot of those things are definitely less in the sights of the AI wave that we are currently dealing with. So that kind of the whole conversation we've had up to this point, was AI always around replacing human work, or is that a new narrative that came later? Was it originally supplemental, designed to shore up areas that needed it, or did it kind of evolve into, well, we can save money if we do XYZ? So
That's a really good point, and you've kind of hit the huge issue right between the eyes, which is that it is a concern today, but it didn't start that way. It started as something to augment and support uh, business operations, government operations. And as I said at the outset, legacy systems, things that we're losing institutional knowledge, or we don't have the right people trained to do this, or we don't have enough of them, we can use these systems as helpmates, as assistants. Uh, there was a great one that Carnegie Mellon did for Ford back then, which was basically as cars were switching over from all analog, spark plugs and oil filters and everything, to some computerized systems. Ford built an AI system that could be wheeled out to any dealership and could take the existing staff of mechanics who are trained on analog and not really familiar with computers. And they could have a laptop and go, okay, I've got this computer thing in front, I've got a computerized car system. How do I deal with this? So they could turn to the computer and say, okay, I'm facing this, the car is doing this, how do I fix this? So they were augmenting the skills of people who were already mechanics, who are already in place at the dealerships. So for the longest time, it was very much, this is going to be great for society. It's going to be beneficial because it's going to help us do things that we don't have the time or the people for. With ChatGPT, again, not to belabor the point, it gets flipped on its head because people, meaning executives, look at it and go, well, wait, I've got people who I pay to do this. Maybe now I don't have to pay them. And for the first, I'd say, year and a half of ChatGPT, which, if we think about it, is only 3 years and 1 month old. It feels like it's been around forever. It's only been 3 years. Um, you had a lot of CEOs or a lot of executives saying, we're going to replace half of our workforce or replace entire divisions. Well, they found out that doesn't really work. You can you can give people a tool that helps them work more efficiently or makes them work makes their work go by faster. But in terms of replacing scads and scads of humans, it doesn't work because you have institutional knowledge of people who've done things and understand that, oh, this is unusual. We need to pivot and do this within the company. AIs aren't doing that. So yes, there's a big push, especially amongst the tech elite in Silicon Valley, saying, "Yeah, we're getting rid of workers, and eventually everybody's going to need universal basic income because nobody's ever going to have to work." The reality is, and MIT just put out a report earlier in the fall, saying only 5% of deployed AIs have resulted in return on investment or staff reduction. Only 5%, because companies find out that once they do it, oh, well, that's fine, but the people we would be replacing are better at doing this, so maybe we'll have them do something else. But the wholesale exodus of workers that is being attached to AI hasn't happened, but that's not going to stop Silicon Valley from saying it's coming.
Yeah, from selling the dream, right? And
Yeah, exactly.
that's a big part of it. And I think there's that famous case, and I can't remember which company it was. It was one of the tech companies where they laid off a bunch of developers
Yeah,
and then hired them all back
yeah, exactly.
probably 2-3 months later, because they realized again that this is primarily a tool to help expand efficiency and reach, and less so replace actual workers. So something I mentioned earlier, something I had mentioned earlier on the risk to smaller companies. Some things like that are real,
Yes.
but there are also areas that are like, is this really going to be the robot apocalypse? Are we all gonna walk into the office one day and it's just gonna be Thinktronic at our desk, doing it
Right,
all
right.
for us? And I don't necessarily feel like that is too founded in reality, though. As you quoted that MIT study, 5% did result in ROI and a scale back on workforce. So there is definitely some areas that are at risk, and this is something we've seen with everything from industrialization to the advent of robotics and plants, where there are areas that are at risk for these things, and there are areas
Right.
that probably not so much. And it seems at least from the research so far, that it's the impact is heavily overblown, and that's probably due to the fact that these companies are selling that dream, so to speak, to the businesses that will buy in. So
And that's why I said, we've seen this movie before. When AI was being pitched in the mid 80s into the early 90s, it was very much a tale of, look, these are new kinds of computer systems. You need to put the money into them, but they will change the way you do business. And so, as I said, it made the front cover of magazines and was featured in the Journal and the Times and everything else. But the reality was the time it took and the cost of introducing these applications was was almost insurmountable. Well, the first wave it was insurmountable. Even today, it's still a question of, well, if you can't just say, here's a chatbot, it's going to replace 30 people. Well, what 30 people and what jobs is it going to replace? You know, are you going to replace this person, this person, this person? Are you giving them their entire workflow and then saying, just go ahead and do it? You still need people to manage the process, at least now. And I think for whether it's a small business or, like you were saying, mom and pop, um, if you look at AI as something that augments what you're doing, then you sort of prevent, or not prevent, you obviate some of the concerns about if it's going to take over what I do. Because the thing that we tell people, and now it's become almost a cliche, is you might not lose your job to AI, but you might lose it to someone who's using AI. So if you're running a small business and you've got competitors, you should be using AI to give you ideas how to reach more customers, on how to expand your product line, on how to save costs or cut costs, how you can get quicker to market. All those things ChatGPT is capable of. And if you're doing it as a business, you can use that as a trusted advisor that can say, okay, you need to do this. You haven't been doing this. You haven't been doing this. And I honestly have done that. I have run business plans through all of the named chatbots and found some stunningly great ideas from that I had not thought of that came back to me simply by saying, you know what, I'd be curious what your thoughts are on this. And I think that's the thing that people, and especially small business owners or individual entrepreneurs, really should look at AI as is like, I don't have a huge team or a huge staff, but all of a sudden I've got something that will talk to me nonstop, 24 hours a day, and I can ask it to give me 1,000 different ideas, and it will do it without bitching and moaning.
Yeah, when I was starting my career, it would be fantastic to have had a knowledge database that could give advice on whatever topic I was struggling with at the time, whether it was,
Right.
Ad creatives or, how to properly optimize, header tags on a website or anything along
Mhm.
those
Yeah.
lines, right? It would have been really useful to have. But to something you mentioned there is it's not like when you look at it replacing people, it replacing a single person, you have to take into account that most people aren't doing one single thing every day when they clock in, right?
Right.
Most people have a really diverse set of responsibilities at any given job, right? Like, mine scale from I'm marketing, right? So mine scale
Right.
from advertising to content to creatives to collateral for our sales team to pretty much everything across the board, right? And to be able to find something that can do that automatically without anybody sitting there and having to prompt it and work with it and use it, yeah, it's a really great tool for helping to expand knowledge base and helping to expand on capabilities. But it's not necessarily something that's very easily plug and play. It's not, a George Foreman grill.
Right.
It's a little
Right.
more nuanced than that.
And I think part of that pitch or the hype that we're getting goes right back to the hype we had in the 30 years ago, which was um, looking at replacing blue collar workers. Like, let's take the standard cliche of the burger flipper. You've got a kid who's standing there all day, and that's his only job is flipping a burger. He's not making the milkshakes, and he's not at the cash register. He's flipping burgers. That mentality of what an employee does has been brought forward 30 years to be like, oh, well, you can replace the employee with a chatbot. Well, your employee is someone who's intelligent and has multiple jobs. They're not just flipping a burger in their job. They are handling, they're creating pitch decks. They're creating, overseeing deployment of websites. They're looking at audience surveys. They're doing all kinds of things. It's not a burger flipping environment. Yet some of the chatbots are being pitched and promoted as that kind of one size fits all because that's all the employee does.
Yeah, which is, I think we've all, you know, I think most people have certainly tried to use it to automate parts of their job, and
Mhm.
it's definitely a little more difficult than what a lot of people say. It's not the analogy of the burger, flipping. It's not the
Right.
single thing, and that's where it kind of when the rubber meets the road, where the pain points are.
Yeah, and that's
So
it's part of the hype cycle, and that hype cycle, as I said, has come back around, and it mirrors exactly what happened decades ago.
So, do you think that hype cycle is why generative AI suddenly feels like a cultural moment and not just a technical one. Is that something that did it feel that way in the 80s and 90s as well?
No, it's the current moment is a technical moment. It's jaw dropping. I mean, when I was doing it in the 80s and 90s, you were you were impressed by seeing a system that um, could fix a boiler. Another one of my favorites from back then was Mrs. Fields cookies, which I think you only see in airports now.
The
But
airports and malls, and
yeah.
my wife gets me one every year for my birthday, and
Oh, great.
I love Miss Fields cookie cakes. I'm plugging it here. Fantastic.
Well, they were brilliant. Her husband was a programmer and was dabbling in AI, and they put together. She had started her business out of her own little shop, and then they expanded rapidly, to malls and airports and all kinds of things, and standalone stores. And in order to capture her expertise, he basically downloaded, all the rules she had for a day of baking and selling. So, they would look at their rule-based system. And let's say they're in Cincinnati and it's a Tuesday morning and it's foggy outside. What are people traditionally buying, in that environment? Do they come in when it's cold? Do they come in only when it's warm? Do I need to go out and offer free samples out on the sidewalk? And so they took all her information and put that in there. And that was really, I think, a great encapsulation of how AI could be used, like at the consumer level. But again, that's all it did. It was Mrs. Fields in a box, basically. So we would see these incremental changes and be impressed by what it could do. I have to say, when I played with ChatGPT the first time, my jaw dropped. It was like, game over. This is what we were working on in the 80s and 90s. Everything that we expected, the machine would talk back to you, it would converse with you, it would find information that you did not immediately have, and it would do it quickly. All of that was a technical marvel that we could not have imagined and were hoping for all those years ago. So because it was so technically jaw-dropping, it became a cultural thing as well. It's very much like, the iPod. We never knew that we could carry our entire library of albums, for those of you who go back that far, carry your entire library of albums on a device that's barely the size of a pack of cards. And that made the iPod not only a technical breakthrough, but a cultural breakthrough. And I think that the changes that we've seen due to ChatGPT mirror that or resemble that uh, as much as any other kind of technical advancement in the last 20 years.
It's actually a really interesting point, and I very vividly remember the advent of iPods. I'm not old enough for albums. I've got a couple on the shelves behind me, but
Darn, I thought you were part of that generation. Okay.
yeah, I started with cassettes though. I
Oh, okay.
remember recording music off the radio on a cassette, and
Sure.
having to wait and try to time it perfectly. And of course, when the song you came on that you wanted to record came on, you were like in the kitchen, you had to sprint
Yeah,
across
you're
and press
waiting
a
to
button.
press the two buttons and like,
Yep.
okay, it's on.
Yeah, exactly. And then your mixtape, it was never perfect, but it worked,
Right.
and then, CDs came out, and then, fast forward, and I remember, I think I heard about the Zune, I think it was
Oh yeah,
before.
that was Microsoft's, right?
I think so.
Their
Yeah.
little device. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Right before I heard about iPods. And this brings up an interesting point is, I don't think many people would remember the name Zune. I don't think many people bought them after iPod took off.
No.
Um, so I wonder what today is going to be the Zune to the Chat GPT iPod. So what's going to be, the models or the things that are in the market that just we don't feel is going to stick around?
It's a good question, and I think that's one that you read about frequently in the business press about the AI bubble. Who's going to succeed? Who's going to make money? Um, the problem is that no AI software companies are making any money. They're living off their investments and subscribers. And they're talking about, like OpenAI, maybe not making any money for the next 3 to 5 years. So it's really hard to predict who's going to be doing that because they just keep getting this influx of investment capital. But typically in America, actually, yeah, let's stick with America. You have kind of the rule of twos, which is that when it comes to technology, all of the different tech platforms, devices, whittle down to two. And you can start all the way back with VHS and beta.
Mm.
Um, you can come forward to um, Apple and Windows, Mac OS and Windows. There are others. There were tons more before Apple, but those have all gone away. You can look at search engines. When after the AI bust, when the internet became the thing to devote tech resources to, you had search engines galore. You had Netscape, you had Alta Vista, you had
Ask
Yahoo.
Jeeves.
Yeah, Ask Jeeves, with the little waiter and all that.
Yeah.
And now, search engines basically are Google and Bing. Um, the same with phones in America. It's basically Android and Apple. So the world, at least the world of the American consumer, tends to whittle those things down to about two. So there will be a lot of competition, at least in the next year to 2 years, between companies like OpenAI and Anthropic and Perplexity and XGrok. Um, all of those will basically try to win the hearts and minds of consumers and corporate users. Is what's going to separate them, and this hasn't happened yet, but what's going to separate them and define who makes uh, the step to being one of the two or one of the ones that succeeds is what other companies build on top of that. So instead of you just having, ChatGPT, there will be a company that does specifically a marketing SEO version of ChatGPT. So you don't need to know all the other stuff that it wants to bring in about, Edgar Allan Poe's poetry or, Aristotle's philosophy. It will focus only on the marketing information you need, and there will be more of it because
Mm.
it will be compiled from other sources that maybe currently aren't in the big LLM that ChatGPT has. So those companies that build on top of ChatGPT or on top of Claude or on top of um, Perplexity will be the companies that ultimately uh, consumers will gravitate to, and the ones that have the most. And again, this is what happened with apps for Apple and certainly with
Mhm.
Microsoft. The more things that you can get that uh, help benefit you, again, in efficiency and speed and cost and your work life, your private life, any of those, you'll start to see people gravitate towards those, and the ones that resonate most on top of existing systems will sort of define who ends up surviving in the long run.
Absolutely. And if you can see the shelf behind me, I have my little Apple, service award. But the big thing that early days that drove adoption of iPhone versus, the other options on the market, a lot of that is attributed to the technology, of course, but to the App Store itself and all of
Right.
the things that were being built and pushed. That's what got people hyped to actually be on the platform, to be able
Right.
to, play these games or these productivity apps or, things along those lines. So that that's a very good point, and one that I hadn't considered, tying that back into, which of these models are going to, grow and survive, and which ones are, might be relegated out of that two option system. That's pretty interesting. Uh,
Oh, feel free to use it whenever you want to
yeah,
talk about AI.
I definitely still. That being said, the marketing, wrapper for it, built on top of it, I would definitely still include Edgar Allan Poe quotes for all of my marketing materials. I think "Hark the Raven, Nevermore" just hits really hard on the thank you page of a proposal.
I
So,
agree.
so let me ask you this: if history teaches us anything about AI, what is it? So
Oh,
what should we have learned from the last 40 or so years that's applicable today that maybe people like I were too young for, maybe others weren't paying attention?
the first thing is don't believe the hype. And that's true almost of anything, but certainly in AI, because it's been shown to result in disaster for the companies that were involved. Not so much for the consumers, because it never really reached the consumer level. It was mostly a corporate, military, government kind of thing. But people, look at. I mean, it's changed a little bit in the last few months, but think back just a year when ChatGPT was just 2 years old and they'd hit 100 million subscribers and they were making money from those subscribers. People are like, oh my God, I'm going to lose my job. And it's on the front page of the Journal every day, or it's on the front page of the Times. I've seen front pages of the New York Times on some days where there are 3 AI articles on the front page. And that makes you think, oh, it's everywhere and it's going to affect me in ways I can't even imagine. Well, yeah, it is, but it's sort of like all of the things the administration is doing every day. It's bombards you with all this stuff. You're like, oh my God, there's just too much. How much of it is really affecting you personally? There's a lot, certainly, emotionally and mentally. It's like drinking from a fire hose. But the same thing applies to AI. Like, oh my God, there's another one that's come out. Or yesterday, or not yesterday, but recently, Meta bought Menus, which is a Chinese AI agentic company. And they're like, okay, well, now they're buying the best of Chinese companies, and they're going to be even bigger. And so we're all going to get these agents. And that's what Meta is going to be pitching. But again, that's hype. Until you hold it, I want to say hold it in your hands, and that you don't do that. Until you have it on your computer or on your phone, it's really just smoke and mirrors. I mean, it works, yes, but you don't need to listen to the stock market's going to crash because OpenAI is overvalued. OpenAI isn't a public company. It's we're looking at it through the lens of what the media thinks it needs to say about AI. Problem is, it's talking about the valuation and the effect on you and your job. It should be talking about the actual applications that work. It should be talking about regulation. It shouldn't be blowing up these outsized expectations of the world being changed, which again is sort of the mantra that you hear from Alphabet and from OpenAI and from Perplexity. It's a good tool. You know what else is a really good tool? Microsoft Word. Um, Put it in perspective. And so I think the thing is, don't believe the hype, but because that's a historical thing. The thing that's not historical is you can use it and use it to your advantage. That was not historical. That's new. And that's something I think people really need to embrace, because life will pass you by, as Ferris Bueller once said. It's moving fast. So you need to take advantage of it and make it work for you.
So, it's tying back into your earlier point at the beginning of this episode about getting into AI because of the sci-fi aspect and all of that, we're going to do a little time traveling. So what do you think future historians will describe about this era of AI? So if we're talking to H.P. Newquist 2 in 2100, what do you think you would say about the 2020s era of AI?
Wow. Well, 2100, hopefully they've cloned me and I'm still around to do that. Um, it's really interesting that you ask that, because there was a book and a movie called Colossus, The Forvin Project, which very few people have seen, but it was back in, I forget if it was 70 or 71. I just reread it a few months ago. And I rewatched it. It's certainly the most accurate depiction of AI ever done, ever, at least today. So if I look back now to whenever that was, 40, almost 50, it was, yeah, 50 years ago. That movie and that book nailed it, nailed the whole concept of LLM and computers talking to each other. And so 50 years on, that movie, which is kind of very, not very well, is the most relevant of all. Yet we talk about the Terminator. That's, oh my God, AI is the Terminator. So with that in mind, and knowing that I'll be completely wrong, because everybody else has been wrong, I think we'll look at this as I do think we'll look at it as the turning point for technology in terms of how people interact with machines. It's different than driving a tractor, or different than operating a printing press. Those were early interactions with machines. This is going to be different because it's going to change the way we view our machines. It's also going to change the way, more than social media, it's going to change the way we interact with the world around us, because this is a too bad, but I think we're going to start looking at AIs as actual others, in terms of, I can talk to this thing, and I think we'll look back in 100 years or 50 years, and thank God it's not Terminator, or hopefully it's not Terminator, but I think we'll look back at it and say our relationship with machines changed dramatically, and more so than at any other point in history.
Yeah, and I think that I hope that the Terminator future doesn't come to pass, because that's definitely the most alarmist version of where
Yeah.
this could possibly head. The idea of going from piloting a computer to having a conversation with it,
Right.
it is kind of that future, and that's something that I also agree with, and that I see being kind of the way that things will be when my kids are older, and 20 years from now, when they're entering the workforce and
Right.
starting to kind of figure it all out. I think it'll be much different than than is today. Just as my first computer ran on MS-DOS, and I had to put in a giant floppy disk and run
Oh yeah, yeah. Swapping
t-
it out every time. Yeah.
yep, playing King's Quest or one of those old games on there.
Right. Right.
Yeah, so it's going to be dramatically different, and I think that you know just staying abreast of the issue, of the topic, and trying to stay on top of these changes, and be that early adopter, even though it can be difficult, and even though a lot of stuff that you try might not pan out, and just trying to use it to your advantage is going to be really important. Because something you mentioned earlier, that employee that is able to utilize AI today is going to be able to be a lot more efficient than somebody that isn't. So
Correct.
yeah, thank you for your time, HB. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was really great to chat with you. I think it's important for people to understand not just the future of AI, but where AI has come from and how it's transformed. I think one of the things that you mentioned about those older school rule sets now being applicable again is really interesting. So HP, do you want to plug any social media accounts besides your SoundCloud today, or?
You can find me. My website is newquist.net. I'm on LinkedIn, Linktree, all of the usual suspect places. If you type in HP Newquist, you can find me buried or hidden in almost all of them.
Awesome. And, just to keep tying it back to the music side, the National Guitar Museum, you guys have a touring exhibition that will be in Tampa in, I believe, May this coming year.
Actually, no, it starts the end of January in Tampa. It'll be
All
at
right.
the Tampa Bay Historical Center, and it does run until May.
So our headquarters is over in St. Pete. I'm down in Florida, so I go across the state once in a while. So I'll have to check it out while I'm there.
Yeah, do
So
let me know when you're going to go. I'll tell you what to look for.
yeah, definitely. I'll have to pick your brains on it later, off the AI focused podcast. But
That would be
uh,
great.
yeah, so thank you everybody that listened to this episode. If you liked it, make sure to follow, leave a review, comment, tell us what you want to hear about next. always happy to get some ideas, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you.